Welcome to Elevated Entertainment, a place where we explore the parallels between our favorite stories in pop culture and our faith. Last week, we tracked Thor's character arc through the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this week, we'll be taking a look at Captain America. Spoiler warning for all the Captain America and Avengers movies, including Endgame. In Captain America, the First Avenger, we meet Steve Rogers as a young, scrawny, idealistic individual who just wants to serve his country. His size never deters his commitment to truth and standing up for what's right.
I can do this all day.
When selected for a secret super soldier program, Steve finally gets the chance to do what he's been longing for, to serve his country. Or so he thinks. After losing the super soldier formula, the government is afraid to let Steve out into the world, lest their secret fall into the wrong hands, and they end up using him as an advertising gimmick instead. However, once his best friend Bucky goes missing, Steve takes matters into his own hands to rescue Bucky and his team, and proves himself a valuable asset to the war, and thus Captain America emerges. He loses Bucky in battle, or so he thinks, and in the culminating fight against Red Skull, Steve makes the ultimate sacrifice to save thousands from a nuclear explosion. Or so he thinks. 70 years later, Steve wakes up in a modern world full of new challenges and having missed a date with the love of his life. In Avengers, we see him trying to navigate this new world and work with a team as he faces new threats from other worlds and exudes a sense of idealism and naivety that sticks out like a sore thumb in this modern landscape. In Captain America the Winter Soldier, his idealism is challenged when the covert organization S.H.I.E.L.D. that he's come to work for turns out to be the very same Hydra that he thought he defeated. Amidst becoming a war criminal on the run, Steve is shocked to find that his friend Bucky is still alive, but now a brainwashed assassin for Hydra. Having his entire world flipped upside down, the one thing Steve is still sure of is that there is still good in Bucky, and he's willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to save him. Surviving the brutal fight to save Bucky's life, Steve reassembles the Avengers to take down the remaining factions of Hydra, and ultimately begins to find a rift between him and Tony Stark as the team cleans up the mess that is Ultron. Ultimately, Steve finds himself the leader of the Avengers, which leads us to Captain America: Civil War, where he continues his search for Bucky. As the government tries to gain control over the Avengers, the team is torn in two. Steve isn't as trusting as he once was. Though he remains true to his ideal, he's lost any sense of naivety and carries a heavier burden than we've ever seen him bear, as him and Tony Stark are pitted directly against each other in this fierce debate, and the rest of the Avengers have to take sides. Rescuing Bucky is still Steve's top priority, and all this results in a heartbreaking battle between him and Tony, and leaves Steve a man on the run once again. Steve is brought into the fight in Avengers Infinity War, where they tragically lose against the Mad Titan Thanos and half of all life is eliminated. Still, Steve is determined to find a way to fix what happened. In Avengers Endgame, we see our heroes go on a journey through time to retrieve the Infinity Stones and undo the damage that was done by Thanos. In the final battle, we see that Steve is such a stand-up guy, he's even worthy enough to wield Thor's hammer. And after winning the fight against the Mad Titan, somebody has to return the Infinity Stones to their original timeline, so Steve volunteers. And upon completing his task, he decides to stay back in time and live a normal life with his love, Peggy. In the last shot of Endgame, we see Steve and Peggy have their long-awaited dance. I'm not crying. You are. What a great ending to Endgame, though, honestly. And I think there's a few lessons we can learn from Steve's story. See, from the very beginning, we see that Steve is so selfless and willing to give up his own life for the sake of others, to stand up for what's right.
Grenade! Get away! Get back!
And one thing we see in Steve's character that I feel is missing a lot today is consistency. Though we do see his character mature throughout the movies and him adapt to the context he's in, his morals are never compromised in the midst of a changing world. And it's something that is really interesting about his character. But a parallel we find to the Christian worldview that I really loved in Avengers Endgame is after, from the very beginning, him being willing to sacrifice himself and him continuing in each movie of just sacrificing himself and putting himself last for the sake of others ultimately is rewarded with this life that he gets to spend with Peggy. And it's really interesting because in the Christian life, Jesus asks us to sacrifice a lot, to die to ourselves, to be willing to give up certain things that this world would tell us we would enjoy or like. But the sacrifices we make in this life really pale in comparison when we think about the eternity that we'll get to spend in heaven. So maybe kind of a poor comparison, but I do kind of see that parallel where Steve was willing to give up things and ultimately was rewarded with something that was so much better. Whereas we kind of see a contrast that we'll get to talk about next week in Iron Man's video. Somebody who was selfish almost their whole life and then at the end made the ultimate sacrifice. Kind of flipped for that character, but we'll talk more about that next week. The main thing is that we can get from Captain America's story is this idea of giving up things now in this life for a better life to come. If you enjoyed this video, thank you for watching. Go ahead and leave a like. You can comment down below if there are other characters besides Thor, Cap, and Iron Man that you want us to do these similar kind of character arc videos for. And subscribe, turn on the notifications so that you can make sure you don't miss next week's video about Iron Man.